Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at the first topic in Unit 1 of Basic Economic Concepts. So, this first unit really deals with the most foundational building blocks of the entire course. And this first video deals with probably the most essential, crucial vocabulary term, which is scarcity. And so, we'll look at that here momentarily, but that is the first of six topics in this unit. So we've got scarcity, followed by resource allocation and economic systems, production possibilities curve, comparative advantage in trade, cost benefit analysis, and then marginal analysis and consumer choice. That's not something you necessarily need to write down or memorize, but just to give you a roadmap as to where we're going in this particular unit. So, with that out of the way, let's deal with topic 1.1 scarcity. At the bottom here, you'll see the reference to the textbook. Those are the pages in your textbook that this particular topic is mentioned. Just keep in mind that it probably will not cover the topic in the exact same way that I am, or even using the exact same terms or phrasing or descriptions, but it is helpful if you want to get another explanation of this very important topic. So let's start with the learning goal, which is to define resources and the cause or causes of their scarcity. And it's that term resource that I want to focus on first. So, a resource is anything used to produce a good or service. And that word used is very, very important to the definition. Because, for example, let's say you have a pencil on your desk, right? So, that pencil, if you pick it up and start writing with it, is a resource because you're using it to produce something, in this case, writing. Whereas if you just leave the pencil on the desk, it's not a resource because it's not being used in that moment to produce anything. So that's why it's really important when you're reading a definition in this class to really understand it and understand why each word in the definition is used. Because in this case, the word used is very important to understanding what a resource is and is not. What's also important to understand is that in this class, you're going to see that some terms, some words or phrases can have multiple synonyms that mean the same thing. So in this case, a resource can also be called an input or a factor of production. And it's critically important that you get comfortable using all three of these terms to mean anything used to produce a good or service. Now, speaking of goods or services, let's define the word good. So, a good in this case is a physical object. So, something like a computer or a water bottle. Okay, so for example, you could have the plastic that's used to make a water bottle, right? The plastic would be the resource, and then the water bottle would be the physical, tangible object that is made from that plastic. So that kind of gives you an example of the relationship between resources and goods. The other thing resources can be turned into is what's called a service. A service is an action or an activity. So, for example, a haircut or a car wash, both of those would be examples of services. They're not tangible. You can't put a haircut in somebody's hand, but it is an action or activity that can be produced from resources. So, for example, if you're going to get a haircut, the scissors, the comb, that the barber would use. Those are examples of resources being used to produce that service, the haircut. So, in this class, we're going to talk about four different types of resources: land, labor, physical capital, and human capital. There actually is a fifth one called entrepreneurship, but that is going to be beyond the scope of this class. We will talk about how businesses, entrepreneurs behave, but that'll happen later on in the course. But the term entrepreneurship is not one that you need to know in this course. So let's talk about each type of resource in turn. So the first one is land. Another term for land is natural resources. So these are resources that come from nature. So, for example, trees, water, basically um, anything that comes from the land, the earth itself, that is an example of a land resource. The second type of resource is called labor. Labor is the effort of workers. And that's really important for you to understand. It is the effort of the workers. It is not the workers themselves. So, for example, if you have a group of people building a house, if they're actually building the house, then that's labor. But if they're just standing around, shooting the breeze, not working on the house, there's no labor being done there. There's no effort being exerted towards the building of that house. So, again, making sure we really understand the definition of terms is going to be critical for your success in this course. The third type of resource, and probably the one that students struggle to pick up the most, is physical capital. These are man made resources. So, really, the complete opposite of land resources that come from nature. So, for example, a hammer, a robot, these are things that are man made that can be used to produce goods and services. In fact, hammers and robots are goods themselves, but they can then be used to make other goods and services. Just like resource, physical capital also has some synonyms I want you to be aware of. In this case, physical capital is also called capital or capital goods. So just be aware of that terminology. And then finally, in this section, talking about the types of resources, we have human capital. That's knowledge and skills. So, for example, knowing 2 plus 2 is 4, or how to ride a bike, any knowledge or skills you're using to produce a good or service. This would be human capital. And this is basically why we send you to school, is to get education, to get human capital that you can use to be productive members of society as you get older. So, before we move on to the next section, what I like to do as we end a subsection of the topic is to have a practice question, just so you can kind of check your understanding and see if you're picking up what we're talking about. So, go ahead and pause the video for a second, read over the question, and then see if you have the correct answer. So in this case, what are the four categories of resources? The correct answer is D, land, labor, physical capital, and human capital. So now we're going to go ahead and turn to what is arguably the most important vocabulary term in this entire course, and that is scarcity. Scarcity is the fundamental problem in economics, and it's the idea that most resources are limited, or what we call rival, but ways to use these resources are unlimited or non rival. There's a lot of ways to use a resource, but we have to make decisions on how to use it. So, for example, if you have a tree, right, a nice tall tree, and you got to decide, am I going to cut down that tree and turn it into paper? Am I going to cut down that tree and turn it into pencils? Am I going to keep the tree up and allow it to be a habitat for animals like an owl, right? You've got to decide, because the reality is, even though there's so many ways to use the tree, you can't do all of them, especially at the same time. And that's the idea of scarcity. It forces us to make choices on how to use so many of the resources that we see around us every single day. And most of these resources that are around us are called rival or scarce resources. And a rival resource is one that cannot be used by more than one person at a time. So, for example, take a pencil, right? A pencil can be a resource. If I'm using the pencil to write something, you cannot simultaneously be using the pencil, right? And so the question becomes, well, who gets the pencil? Is it the person who needs it the most? Is it the person who could pay the most? Those are questions that we ask in economics. One thing that is not a rival or scarce resource is established knowledge, human capital. Remember, that's knowledge and skills. So, for example, I can know 2 plus 2 equals 4 at the exact same time you know 2 plus 2 equals 4, and we both can apply it to whatever good or service we're producing and not have to worry that, oh man, if I'm using that knowledge, you can't somehow be using that knowledge, right? Knowledge is universal in that way. That's a wonderful thing about it. And another reason that you're sent to school to get that human capital. Like I said before, scarcity forces people and societies to decide how best to use their scarce resources. With that tree, am I going to cut it down and turn it into paper? Am I going to keep it up for the owl? If I spend an hour watching a movie, I can't spend that hour eating at a restaurant. I have to make choices, right? I have to decide how am I going to use those resources. And one of the very important things about these choices is that we can't just focus on what do we get. We also have to focus on what do we give up. So, in that previous example with the movie and the restaurant, we're really talking about the resource of time. If I spend that time going to the movie, I am giving up going to the restaurant, right? And that's a pretty trivial example, but sometimes these decisions can have really significant consequences. For example, if you decide to go to college, you're giving up going into the workforce right away full time and all the money and benefits that come with that. But if you decide to go into the workforce full time, you're giving up that experience that you get on a college campus. And so you have to make choices. But what economics teaches us is that it's important to think about not just what we get when we make a decision, but the trade offs, anything that is given up when making that decision. And so now let's go ahead and turn to another practice question. So go ahead and read the question and the answer choices, pause the video, and then let's see if you're right. So the correct answer here is E, limited resources and unlimited wants. That's the idea of scarcity. We want so many different things, but our resources to achieve those things are limited. And that brings us to what is economics? Economics is essentially the study of choices. How do people manage their scarce resources? What are people going to do with the tree? What are people going to do with their time? That's the idea of economics. It's about choices. What I often tell people when they ask me, well, what is economics? Is it just about money in the stock market? I say, no, it's really if psychology and math had this weird mutant child, right? We think about how do people make choices, and then we use math, graphs, that kind of stuff to help illustrate what we're talking about. So it's really the study of choices. And it's fascinating because you can apply this to everything from sports to music to art to business. Economics touches every facet of the human experience, and that is why it is such a cool topic to study. And so, just like in math, speaking of math, where you have geometry, algebra, calculus, trigonometry, all these different branches of math, you actually have two major branches in economics. And that's where I want to wrap up this video, is talking about those branches, microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics, you see the prefix micro there, meaning small or tiny. That is the study of the economic decisions of individuals and firms. So, how do individuals and firms make decisions about their scarce resources? So, for example, a question that might be studied in micro is, should a business be taxed for its own pollution? If a business, a factory, decides to make a product and that creates pollution that harms the environment, should we be taxing the business to help manage that pollution? That's a question that gets debated in microeconomics. And just so you know, before we move on, a firm is another word for a business. You may have already known that, but I thought I would mention it here. The other major branch of economics is called macroeconomics. The prefix macro here means big or large, and it is the study of the economy as a whole. So if micro is zooming in on individuals and businesses, macroeconomics is zooming out on the big picture of the economy as a whole. So, for example, a question you would study in macro is, what level of inflation or prices should the government allow? Prices touch every part of the economy, and that's why it's studied in macro. An economy, speaking of which, is a system for organizing the production and use of goods and services. So basically, it is the answer to the question, what are we going to make? How are we going to make it? Who's going to get what we make? That's the idea of an economy. It is the answer, a society's answer to scarcity. And we'll look at economies a lot more coming up in the second topic in this unit. Finally, let's do one more practice question to wrap up this video. So go ahead and pause the video, read the question, and see what you come up with. So, did you get the correct answer? It is E. How would an increase in taxes affect the economy as a whole? So, when we're looking for a macro question, we're looking at something that looks at the big picture. And those key words in answer choice E is economy as a whole. The other four choices all would deal with microeconomics. So that's all for this video on scarcity. Until next time, have a great day.